A member of your family is dying, and the organ that he or she needs to stay alive goes to someone else, not because they need it more, but because their hospital is trying to make money by doing more transplants. Well, prosecutors say it has happened, and happened when close to 2,000 people a year die waiting for donor livers. Here's senior correspondent Chris Wallace.
The clock was ticking, and time was not in Jerry's favor.
For Jerry and Sally Mikesell of Peoria, Illinois, every minute counted. He had serious liver disease and desperately needed a transplant. His only chance to go on the waiting list for a donor organ.
It's the only hope that you have. It's a lifeline.
Over the months, Jerry wasted away, losing more than 100 pounds. But the Mikesells never lost hope, because as each new organ is donated, the rules of the waiting list specify the sickest patients are first in line.
You and your husband put your trust in this waiting list and in the way it was operated.
We trusted that what the doctors were doing was fair, and we trusted that what they were doing was in our best interest.
But what if doctors didn't follow the rules? What if they lied about their patient's condition to jump them up the waiting list ahead of people who needed transplants more desperately? Well, federal prosecutors say that's exactly what happened at some of the biggest hospitals here in Chicago.
They committed a fraud on the program, and they arranged to have people get liver transplants ahead of people who deserve them more urgently.
U.S. Attorney Patrick Fitzgerald charges that hospitals at Northwestern University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Illinois all put profits over people's lives, that they manipulated the waiting list to corner the market on scarce livers and the millions of dollars that come with doing liver transplants. Which brings us to this man who helped stop the alleged abuse, one of the world's leading transplant surgeons, who says he's been forced into a sort of medical exile ever since he blew the whistle.
It's the Walmart principle that volume drives the business.
Wait a minute, you're talking Walmart. This is liver transplants. This is a matter of who lives and who dies.
But it's a business.
Dr. Raymond Pollak, born in South Africa, was in charge of the University of Illinois at Chicago's transplant department. Pollak says in the mid-90s, he noticed other hospitals were suddenly filled with an astonishing number of liver patients they said were critically ill.
So either something was bad in the water in Chicago, or we had a serious problem with liver disease that no one else seemed to have.
Then Dr. Pollak says, to his shock, it started happening at his hospital. He says patients listed as level 3 on the waiting list, still healthy enough to live at home, were being checked in supposedly in critical condition. Pollak says some of his colleagues were jumping their patients up the list, falsely listing them as level 1, likely to die in 7 days without a transplant.
Doctors would lie about the specific medical conditions of their patients.
They would claim the patients were unconscious on the same day that the patient was down in the physical therapy department on a treadmill.
You're kidding.
I kid you not. And in some instances, getting weekend passes to go home.
So these are people that are level 1, supposedly within 7 days of dying, and they're going home for the weekend?
That's correct. Going to pay a parking ticket. One woman was even in a clown costume promoting a blood drive.
If you still can't believe it, listen to the story of Gary Rode. He was a level 3 patient, healthy enough to keep working on a loading dock. But his sister Terry says doctors at the University of Illinois at Chicago kept pressing him to get a transplant.
He was told he was going to be taken over to the hospital in a wheelchair because then they could lower his level from a 3 to a 2 or a 1. Because that way they would say that he was sicker and so sick he couldn't walk over.
But Terry says despite the pressure, she and her brother refused to go along.
If you have not gotten sicker, then why are you getting a transplant when another human being could use that liver and maybe live?
And what happened to other patients who were sicker and needed those livers right away?
Our conventional wisdom is that they either got sicker, were bypassed, or in fact passed away waiting for those livers.
Do you believe that some patients died needlessly because of this practice?
I do believe that.
Why would any doctor do such a thing? Pollak says the answer is money. At $250,000 per transplant, he says the hospitals wanted to do as many as possible.
Imagine the amount of money you can generate by having people walk through the door all begging for liver transplants, many of whom perhaps in the long run may not need them.
Doctors and hospitals were gaming the transplant waiting lists for profit?
I believe they were.
So Pollak went on a crusade, complaining to administrators about what he said was the abuse of the transplant waiting list. Nurses in the intensive care unit also warned the university about the unethical practices being employed by the liver transplant team. Finally, Pollak was called to a meeting with the dean of the medical school, Dr. Gerald Moss.
And he asked me, quote, what was wrong with doing things the Chicago way?
In other words, if other institutions are cheating and getting away with it, you should too?
That's what I was being asked. That's correct.
Dean Moss and the university refused to comment on Pollak's account of the meeting.
Dr. Pollak wrote letters and complained to his superiors for years about patients being admitted to the intensive care unit here who he says didn't need such drastic treatment. Finally, the University of Illinois at Chicago did something about it. They removed Pollak as head of the transplant division.
To think that my own institution would seek to punish me for doing the right thing. That's how we raise our children. Do the right thing. They were willing to take me and basically throw me aside as so much garbage.
I can see the hurt in your eyes still.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Pollak's family says the struggle has taken a terrible toll on him. He says he's been prevented from practicing transplant surgery, and his salary has been cut by 2/3. He tried to look for new jobs, but says the university told other hospitals it couldn't provide a reference on the advice of its lawyers. But Pollak still wasn't beaten. He walked into the federal building in Chicago and told prosecutors what was going on.
3 of Chicago's most prominent hospitals tonight stand accused of organ transplant fraud.
When word of the government's case broke, it was big news in Illinois. And no one was hit any harder than Sally Mikesell of Peoria. Remember, her husband Jerry waited for months for a transplant. His liver never came, and Jerry died.
I couldn't believe that anyone who had the power to make life and death decisions would abuse it. There are a lot of people, I'm sure, affected by those decisions in that flawed system.
Sally says she wonders if someone who was jumped up the list at another hospital may have gotten the liver that would have saved her husband.
He might have been with his family where he belonged. He might have been able to see his grandkids grow. Yeah.
While it comes too late for Jerry Mikesell, the transplant waiting list has now been reformed. Placement of patients is now determined by medical tests, not just a doctor's word.
We don't think the case is likely to settle.
And what about the man who fought so hard to clean up the system?
So do you think I need
Dr. Pollak has filed a lawsuit claiming his hospital punished him for not going along with the fraud. But his once brilliant career has reached a dead end. He works only 1 day a week, making the 3-hour drive to a job at the University of Illinois Hospital in Peoria. He teaches there, but no longer does transplants.
So you want to look at purplish discoloration of the skin?
At the same time, many of those he accuses of committing fraud have been promoted.
Looking at it objectively, have they won and have you lost?
No, I won, because I maintained my integrity. I maintained the integrity of the system. And if I was to be faced with a circumstance of a similar nature in the future, I think I would do exactly the same.
The hospitals turned down our requests for an interview, but say they did nothing wrong and stand by their patient care. Northwestern and the University of Chicago say their suits revolved around accounting discrepancies and were settled for small amounts of money. The government is still pursuing its suit against the University of Illinois, which says it's working to resolve the matter and that it will vigorously contest Dr. Pollak's claims of retaliation.
Primetime Thursday. We'll be back with more.